Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I want to wish you a happy St. Patrick's Day. Yes, it is March 17th, and despite social distancing, which I am trying to practice, it's not hard for an introvert to practice social distancing, but despite that, I pretty much celebrated St. Patrick's Day the same way I do every year, which is to wear green and wear ridiculous shamrock socks of some sort, ridiculous St. Patrick's Day socks of some sort. That's kind of how I celebrate most holidays, is with silly socks and themed things. I drink my coffee out of a shamrock mug, whatever. See, I don't get out much, so social distancing, not a problem. At any rate, one nice thing about having a book review podcast wherein I do all of my interviews via internet means that I do not have to cancel interviews with authors. I can still chat with them about their books because we are not in the same room. We are definitely not 6 feet apart. In fact, my interview today, the author was in Florida while I was in California. Definitely social distancing in that case. The author that I'm speaking with this week is Kiel Barnekov, and we are talking about his debut novel. It's called Shepherds of Destiny. It is the first in a series, and here is the description of that book. There are many who believe that there is no such thing as coincidence, that events are guided by providence to a predestined outcome. In Shepherds of Destiny, Providence incorporates the supernatural and futuristic medical technology to oversee and guide critical events, both past and future, to defeat attempts by evil forces to enslave humankind. So that's the description, and there's science fiction in this book. There's time travel. There is, it's set in the not too distant future. There's some pretty impressive medical advancements and technologies that are employed in this story that enable the story to happen in a lot of ways. There's a lot going on in terms of science fiction, not necessarily fantasy because it's science, not magic, but definitely in that realm of science fiction and historical fiction, because there is some time travel. There are 3 incidences of time travel, 2 to the past, once to the Civil War, once to World War II, and 1 to the future, somewhere in the 2050s, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. So you get some historical fiction with the Battle of Gettysburg and an encounter between King George and Winston Churchill. So you've got various things, as I said, going on here: science fiction, historical fiction, and pretty much a cliffhanger. I'm not really giving any spoilers by telling you that this is the first in a series and it ends a little bit abruptly. You're like, well, okay, clearly I'm going to need to tune into the next book, the second book. Very sneaky, Heel. You did that well. At any rate, the book is called Shepherds of Destiny. I do have copies to give away, so stay tuned until the end of the podcast to find out how you can win a copy of Shepherds of Destiny by Kiel Barnekov. In the meantime, let's go ahead and get to that interview with Kiel. Kiel, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you.
It's wonderful to have you here. We are here to talk about your new book. It's called Shepherds of Destiny. It's the first in a series. Before we get to the book, though, if you could share a little bit about yourself, that would be wonderful.
Sure. Well, I'm down here in sunny Florida where the virus is spreading quickly, mainly from travelers coming in from other parts of the country. And They were coming from Europe, but they're not anymore. So maybe that's a good thing for a little while. But anyway, yeah, I live in Florida now, and I spent most of my career in the aviation industry. So, a lot of it with a couple of different airlines, and then I went into the airport industry, where the airports actually manage their operations, and all of that was under the realm of IT, if you will. I've been an IT director, IT manager for a number of years. And 2 years ago, I elected to step back out of that and start writing. It's been great. I've enjoyed the time off. I've enjoyed writing, so I'm here and loving it. So.
That's wonderful. Okay, so as I said, Shepherds of Destiny is the first in a series. Can you give us an overview of the story of this first book?
Sure. Well, it starts out in the year 2028, which isn't that far away, actually. Christian Barnett, he's a billionaire through an inheritance of his parents' estate, and he's CEO of Barnett Industries, which develops, manufactures, and implements advanced transportation systems globally. He falls ill at the age of 33 with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. It's a debilitating disease, and it's one of the worst, in my opinion, that anybody can contract. Dr. Savannah Richards, neurosurgeon and research scientist at the Stanford Neuroscience Health Center, has developed a means to preserve the brain of a patient whose body has been irrecoverably destroyed, but whose brain is unharmed. Concurrently, Dr. Ansley Barnett, wife of Christian Barnett, is leading the development of a cyborg body indistinguishable from a human body for DARPA, for the military, U.S. military. Soon after Christian's brain is removed and placed in stasis, he's approached by the Guardian. And the Guardian is a spiritual being who watches for timelines that are going astray and threatening the existence of humanity. The Guardian enlists Christian's mind, and his mind is untethered from his corporeal body to control the actions of individuals key in keeping the timeline on its predestined course. In his spiritual state, Christian is able to travel to any period in the past or to the future with the Guardian in order to effect changes to the timelines that are going wrong. With Christian's spirit in tow, the Guardian travels back in time to the U.S. Civil War to counter a threat to the timeline where the Union won the war is in jeopardy, where the threat to the timeline is where the Confederacy actually wins the Civil War. Should Christian fail to complete his assignment, the history of the United States has changed and the country will not survive World War II. Now, there's another character we're introducing here, Aaron Adams. He's also suffering from ALS, and he's about 10 years later in the year 2038. By that time, Christian is pretty well along the path for ALS and is essentially almost completely disabled. Well, Aaron is approved for Savannah Richards' brain preservation procedure. But prior to the procedure, his mind is scanned. They're able to scan his mind and download it digitally to a cyborg body. Aaron is approached by the Guardian. Since his mind is now also separated from his corporeal body, his assignment from the Guardian confronts a rift in time that threatens the outcome of World War II and ultimately the free world. Now, Christian and Aaron, under the guidance of the Guardian, then go forward into the future, to the year 2052, where the CEO of a high-tech information management company and two multi-billion-dollar telecommunications moguls have developed a new smartphone supporting an advanced communications technology. That technology enables the ability to control a user's thoughts and actions without the knowledge of the user, or without the consent of the user. So, and that's basically, they are actually successful in thwarting that effort in the future. But what you'll see coming in book 2 is that when they go back to their normal time, actually it's 2042 by this time, when they go back to that time, they decide that they might be able to derail this technology that is going to be able to take over someone's mind and have them do things they otherwise wouldn't, using cellular communications. So that's where kind of leaves off at this stage of the book, and then goes, and then book 2 picks it up. And by the way, I'm about 80% of the way through book 2, so that'll be coming out hopefully in the next few months.
I was just going to ask that. Thank you.
Let me pop in here for a bit so we can take our first break of the podcast. When we come back, Kiel will be speaking more about his inspiration for this story, for this series. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Kiel Barnekov about his debut novel, Shepherds of Destiny.
So what was your inspiration for not only the first book, but for this series in general?
Well, really, I've always been a fan of history. In fact, I almost went into history as a professional in academia, but I decided not to at the last minute. But anyway, it's thinking about how certain events in history, we've come so close, many times to things going a different way, and what would happen if they did. And that's something that's kind of floated in and out of my head for a number of years now. So really, it was sort of putting it in perspective. And one story that I read by Stephen King called 11/22/63 about the assassination of President Kennedy, where the protagonist goes back in time and is able to thwart that assassination. But when he comes back to his real time in the future, everything is a total mess because Kennedy lived. I was like, well, that sounds interesting. This was a few years ago when I read it.
Yeah.
So I think that's what may have triggered my interest in doing it this way. The other part of it too is ALS. I mentioned earlier, it is that would be the disease I would fear the most, because you're mentally competent right up to the very end, so you're aware that your body is literally shutting down on you over a period of, could be 2, 3, 5, or even 10 years. To get to the end, and to me that's more scary than anything I can think of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In terms of the historical events that you mentioned, you did mention two: one in the Civil War, one in World War II. What about those two events made you decide to use those as your jumping off points for changing the timelines?
Well, when I started looking around, I started looking at the Civil War initially, and I was familiar with the history around Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee and the relationship they had and the successes they were able to achieve together in the earlier part of the war. And that jumped out at me, and when I did some research, it looked like there were a number of historians that were in agreement that had Stonewall Jackson lived, then he and Lee would have won the war for the South. They were that good as far as being generals and leaders and military men. But when he left, it left Lee depending on others that were not nearly as competent as Jackson was. And the mistakes made at Gettysburg were the turning point in the war. With regard to World War II and Churchill, Churchill's always been a fascination to me. He's just an amazing guy, and some of the things he pulled off were really incredible. And the one that's in the book is probably the most incredible, where he was up against his entire war cabinet. At one point, the King of England was sort of very skeptical about Churchill, and yet he was able to pull it off in the end and bring the country together and be able to lead the country with the Allies' help in defeating Hitler. And that had he capitulated to them, to the war cabinet, and to their parliament, then heavens knows what would have happened if Hitler had taken England. It could have been a very, very different world today had he done that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So there's kind of multiple main characters in the story, because you've got Savannah and Ansley on one side with the medical stuff, but then you've got Christian and Aaron who are working with the Guardian. What about Christian and Aaron do you think will resonate with readers?
Well, I think first of all, Christian being a billionaire, we have these billionaires. I use Elon Musk as sort of a remote model, if you will, for Christian, as to kind of being out there a little bit, very affluent, very, very well off. I mean, the description of the mansion I was able to put together from looking at a number of different of these estates out and, looking virtually online at these estates and what they had. And I think people look up, either they disdain them or they admire them, one or the other, which is kind of a love-hate thing for these billionaires. So I think that at least will bring people's interest in Christian. Aaron is kind of an everyday kind of guy. He was a programmer, if you will, and excuse me, he got ALS at a relatively young. He's a little older than Aaron, but he still got it at a pretty young age. And he's kind of the everyday guy, professional type programmer, IT guy, and just got caught up in this and had the opportunity presented to him because Ansley wanted to try the downloads that she had been experimenting with, downloading the mind to the cyborg body, but she didn't want to do it the first time on her husband, Christian. So here comes this new guy, Aaron, and he's willing and ready. He doesn't want to face what he's looking at in terms of the outcome of ALS. So he says, "Yeah, do it." And so he's thrown into it and does very well, and ultimately later on becomes almost a partner of Christian as they go forward. And in book 2, they actually do get much closer together as far as professionally working on this threat of the cellular technology.
Interesting. Yeah. So how much research did you do for the book? Because there's a lot of science in this book.
Yeah. A lot of it's, I kind of had in the back of my head, but for the war, for the Civil War research, I actually went and visited Gettysburg, did a tour of the battlefields up there. I watched a number of different Civil War films about the war, about Gettysburg. Did a lot of it, read a couple of books. For Churchill, didn't get to visit England for the book, but I have been there several times in the past through my career. But reading about Churchill's professional career, a number of books, watched several dramatizations, movies, etc. That were and Gary Oldham was excellent in his depiction of Churchill, and that's really pretty much the research, the cellular technology and the technology side of it. I'm kind of more or less familiar with through my career in technology. So, and I kind of keep an eye on that still as far as what's coming out, what the new things are that are coming out, Envision, things like that. So.
Okay. How many books do you envision for the series?
This particular series, I'm going to close it out with book 3. I mean, like I said, I'm in the middle of, or towards the end of actually completing book 2. And then I will hopefully begin book 3 later this year. But after that, I think there are plenty of side plots in the trilogy that can be used to go off and write other stories. Write a story about Ansley and how she was able to get into DARPA and do what she was doing and things like that. So another story maybe about Savannah and how she became such a a medical, savant dealing with the brain. Those types of things could come out later as sort of new single series books.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There are themes throughout the book of good versus evil, as well as the concept of predestination. So did you always want to have both of those themes, or how might the book be different if you had just gone with predestination and not with good versus evil, or the other way around? Did you ever think about only doing one or the other?
Not really. It just sort of came to me. Good versus evil, that's been a constant that has been portrayed throughout human history. And the general outcome is usually that good overcomes evil in the end. But, how and why do we think that's inevitable? And we always think that good's going to win, good's going to do this. Well, maybe there's a way that happens, and maybe there's some support that says how that end will be achieved. And I guess that's where I came in with the good versus evil concept that supports, it justifies the reason for the guardian. The guardian's there for a reason. And he's the one that guides the human minds that can go and take control of another human. He can't do it. He's not able to do it. If he tried to do it, he'd kill somebody. But they are able to do it, or they can kind of watch and see if they need to step in, or they can actually influence people when they sleep, when they dream, whatever, to come up to a decision. So there's a number of different opportunities there. That the guardian is there as a guide that helps them achieve their duties and their responsibilities with this. And then, of course, the good versus evil, again, that's a pretty common theme throughout literature for years or for decades. I mean, even the Bible, in a sense, is a good versus evil type of thing. So that's why it's such a common thing and well-known thing that's why I included that with the predestination. So, I mean, predestination, the thinking is that, you have a God, the supreme being, whoever you believe in, is there to see that good is achieved. Predestination is perhaps one way that happens.
Time for our second break of the podcast. Some of you probably know that I also host the GSMC Bible Study podcast, that I have an MDiv, and I have studied theology in a past life. Okay, it wasn't really a past life. It was just a while ago. So I really kind of wanted the conversation to go in a very theological direction, but I held back and I kept it more toward the book side of things rather than the Bible study side of things. You're welcome. We're going to go ahead and take our second break of the podcast, and when we come back, the conclusion of my interview with Kiel. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Bible Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. You have seen my book nerdishness, and now you have seen a little bit of my theological church nerdiness. Let's go ahead, though, and not talk about my nerdiness anymore. We'll go back to that interview with Kiel.
Okay, and we could have a whole huge, long philosophical, theological conversation about predestination versus free will, and we could do that. But you do touch on that a little bit in terms of free will and predestination in the book. Will you be exploring those themes further in the next two?
Oh yes, they're definitely there. You know, one thing I like to use the example of in the Christian Bible, is Paul the Apostle. Paul, or he was called Saul before he was converted to a good guy, to an apostle. But he was a nasty guy. I mean, he was a persecutor of Christians. He was probably a murderer in many sense of the word. And all of a sudden, poof, God comes in and changes him. And now he's one of the greatest apostles that have been documented. And it's okay, you know, isn't that sort of the same kind of thing where control is exerted over an individual to get them to do something that they never would have done had not a supernatural element been inserted here. So that's kind of the one thing in my head, or the one example in my head, I guess, that always stands out.
Yeah, interesting. And again, we could have another huge, long conversation about that.
Yeah.
And we could argue whether or not Paul was still a jerk after he got converted, but that's another story. So you said you started writing about 2 years ago. Is it something that you'd always wanted to do and kind of had in the back of your mind?
Well, actually, I kind of started writing when I was a kid. And I would write short stories, a couple, 3 pages, whatever, when I was 9 or 10 years old, and did several of those. I wish I still had them, actually. It'd be fun to show my grandson. But and then I wrote my first book. It was a child's book back in the mid-1980s, and didn't get it published at the time. Of course, you didn't have self-publishing back then, pretty much, like you do today with Amazon and everything. And then 2 years ago, I decided if I was ever going to get serious with this, I needed to really step back from my professional career and get to it and actually do it. And financially, I was able to do it, and so it worked out. But really seriously, for probably always wanted to do it, but never really had the time, raising a family, working full time, et cetera, and you just didn't really have the time to devote to it until I retired from my professional career 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm. In the biography on the back of the book, you mention your grandmother, who was also an author, Fleur Conkling.
Yes, Fleur Conkling. She wrote mostly children's books back in the, I guess, in the 50s, 1950s, and she was always an inspiration for me. I mean, I loved her books, and she was always a special person for me. So that's why I mentioned her on my first book.
Yeah, I love that. So from your journey to published author, do you have advice for aspiring authors?
Well, I thought about that question. And first, write only if you enjoy writing. You shouldn't write if you think you're going to be on the New York Times bestseller list or get a movie gig, because you probably won't. There are thousands of new books published every day now, and yours will be a drop of water in an ocean. But when you do publish, don't be shy about telling anyone you know, and even those whom you don't know. It's best to have as many evangelists for your book as possible. Kind of build a team, a social team, if you will, that will help evangelize your book for you. And that definitely, I know it helped me, and I'm sure it would be advice to just about any, particularly new author.
Okay, thank you for that. When you take the time to read for yourself, who are your favorite authors or genres?
Well, I mentioned Stephen King earlier. He's certainly one that I've read for a number of years. And actually, I have a postcard. We sent him a little postcard back in the 70s. When I think we read The Stand or one of his earlier ones. And sent him a postcard, sent him how much it was, and he sent a postcard back. it was really kind of cool. I still have it.
Oh, fun. Yeah.
But other than King, I love Asimov, and I like Sanford pretty well, and Lee Child pretty well. So.
And you mentioned your grandson earlier. I'm always nosy about what people are reading, especially at various different ages. So, do you read with your grandson?
Not too much yet, but it's probably something I will be doing. In fact, I gave him some excerpts. His name actually is used in book 2, and I gave him some excerpts to look at. And he was like, "Wow, this is really cool. Is that me?" I said, "Sure, that could be you." Nice. So, yeah, he's a very talented kid, very bright kid, and he's probably out of my 5 grandchildren, I think he's probably the favorite right now.
Oh, I'm not going to touch that one. So I know you have a website, so if you can share your website as well as where people can find you and interact with you on social media.
Sure. My website is just Kiel Barnekov, one word, myname.com. Facebook, I'm on Facebook, and my Twitter handle is @BaronKB.
So we've talked a little bit about the book and the series. Is there anything, though, that we haven't covered in this interview that you want to share about writing or the book, anything that we haven't touched on?
Well, one of the things I'm thinking about doing, just started thinking about it in the last couple of days because of all this virus nonsense going on, but looking into seeing if I can get on Amazon and just offer the digital copy free. It's already free if you have a Kindle subscription, I guess. But, reading's a great way to pass the time when you're stuck at home or in a hospital for any length of time. So if I could give it to people free to help them get through their, a couple of hours of their day, I wouldn't mind doing that. So I'm going to look into that with Amazon and see what has to happen, or if there's costs I have to associate with that or anything.
Yeah. Oh, that's really nice. Thank you. Well, Kiel, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to speak with me about the book. It is called Shepherds of Destiny. Oh, what's book 2 called? Do you have a title for book 2?
It's going to be Shepherds of Destiny. The book 2 part will probably be replaced, or maybe book 2 with a subtitle. I don't know what that is yet. So.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you so much for speaking with me. I really enjoyed chatting with you, and I'm definitely interested to find out what's going to happen in the next book and where Christian and Aaron and possibly someone new are going to end up going in time.
Okay. Sounds good.
Thank you once again to Kiel for taking time to practice social distancing and talk to me over the phone to record this interview. I really appreciate it. Again, the book is Shepherds of Destiny. It is book 1 in what looks to be a trilogy, possibly with some standalone stories as well. And it is out now. You can also win a copy of this book if you simply go to the GSMC Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram pages and comment on this post, episode 220, interview with Kiel Barnekov. Tell me in the comments, you need to comment in order to enter the giveaway. Tell me where in time you would like to go. If you could pick one moment in time. And we're not talking like going back in time and spending 20 years. No, we're talking one moment in time. Where would you go? That's really hard. There's too many moments in time that I would want to go back to. But in order to win a copy of Shepherds of Destiny, go to Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, GSMC Book Review, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Comment on episode 220, interview with Kiel Barnekov, and tell me where in time you would go if you had the opportunity to go one place in time. Thank you, as always, to you, my listeners. I appreciate it. I hope you had a lovely St. Patrick's Day, whatever that involved. I hope you're staying safe. I hope you're washing your hands and staying healthy. And please don't hoard toilet paper. Please. It's just, It's not cool. Don't do it. Build a book fort. Build, do other things, but don't hoard the toilet paper. I'm asking you from the bottom of my nerdy little heart. Thank you, as always, for joining me. Join me again next time. In the meantime, perfect chance to get lost in a good book as you practice social distancing. I'll talk to you next time. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.